glory to the gods of common sense, for Australia voted no to the dangerous, racist Indigenous voice to Parliament. And it wasn't just any old no. Far from the double majority needed to win a referendum, not only did it lose the national vote about 61% to 39%, not a single state voted yes. Even the reputationally progressive states of Victoria and New South Wales voted no by about 55% and 59% respectively. In fact, the only jurisdiction that voted yes was the Australian Capital Territory, that land of politicians and public servants who just love any chance to expand the power of bureaucracy and the elites. As to who else voted yes, well, it came as no surprise the metropolitan lefty lovies in our capital cities did so, with the exception of Adelaide. In fact, the state of South Australia offered up arguably the most emphatic no of the night, with not a single electorate recording a majority yes vote. As for who voted no, well, you only had to step into the suburbs and beyond to find the majority of Australians had given the voice the flick, unconvinced as they were by the subpar campaigning from Yes 23. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was disappointed, to say the least, but was able to semi-acknowledge the government's shortcomings.
We argued for this change not out of convenience, but from conviction, because that's what people deserve from their government. And of course, when you do the hard things, when you aim high, sometimes you fall short. And tonight we acknowledge, understand and respect that we have.
Reactions from other yes advocates, both in the campaign and the media, were not quite as manicured. The general tenor of the clamour was that they'd done nothing wrong. It was instead the No campaign at fault for spreading lies and misinformation that fooled the public. Federal Greens leader Adam Bandt demonstrated this attitude rather well.
What's clear from the campaign, though, is that Peter Dutton is the master of misinformation. Peter Dutton's Liberals led a campaign of misinformation. Peter Dutton ran a Trumpian campaign of misinformation and fear that has the potential to set back reconciliation in this country unless we address it.
Adam Bandt wasn't the only crumpled yes campaigner who, for some reason, made a bizarre reference to Donald Trump. Voice architect Professor Marcia Langton did the same during an interview on The Point in response to criticism from No campaign leader Warren Mundine that she had racially vilified Australians.
You know, this is a very Trumpian play. This is the Steve Bannon playbook. Create racial division and by lying, and then accuse me of being a provocateur.
Now, why anyone would use a reference to a play being Trumpian or associated with Trump, in the case of his former White House chief strategist Steve Bannon, as an insult is quite baffling. Donald Trump has been lied about every which way until sundown and has been indicted 91 times on bogus charges, and he still manages to be as popular as ever with the Republican Party. If anything, the Yes campaign should have taken a leaf out of the Trumpian playbook. And as for Marcia Langton accusing Warren Mundine of creating racial division by lying, well, she should really take a look at her own behaviour in recent weeks, to which Warren Mundine was referring before she makes that kind of statement.
Every time the No case raises one of their arguments, if you start pulling it apart, you get down to base racism. I'm sorry to say it, but that's where it lands. Or just sheer stupidity.
Then there was the reaction of the lefty media class, who seemed quietly saddened that the little people just couldn't get their heads around voting for the Voice. This attitude was epitomised by host of Channel 10's The Project, Waleed Ali.
The biggest dividing line seems to have been education. So if you are in a seat that had high levels of tertiary education, a bachelor or postgrad, then you were at the very top end of the yes vote. And if you had the lowest levels of tertiary education, you were at the low end of the yes vote. And that's not to say people who are educated know what they're doing and people who don't have tertiary education don't. It's about the style of the message, I think. And the concept of a voice is... I can totally see why you would propose it. If you go through the history, you go through the experience of the people who designed it or who came up with the idea, it actually makes perfect sense. But most people haven't been on that journey. And when you come to them with this idea that's actually quite abstract and complicated, they're going to respond with an instinct. And that instinct is, it just doesn't feel
And then
right.
it doesn't help us.
Now, the reason there is a correlation between having gone to university and voting yes is not because of intelligence. Some of the stupidest people I've ever met are university graduates. It's because of the cultural framework in which universities educate people. That is, we all know university campuses are flamingly left-wing and have been so for decades. If you've gone to university, you are going to have spent more time in a highly concentrated, woke, left-leaning environment than someone who hasn't. It's a scarce few of us who make it out of university unscathed by the cultural Marxism permeating every corridor. And while sure, there were people on the right who voted yes, the concept of the Voice is steeped in identity politics and the ideology of decolonization, both of which are very left-wing. And you only need to look at the fact that according to the polls before the referendum, about 70% of Greens voters intended to vote yes, as opposed to upwards of 80% of coalition voters who intended to vote no. It's political orientation, not education or indeed intelligence, that maketh the university-educated lean left. But it was the reaction of voice architect Thomas Mayo that revealed why Australia was really, really lucky to have dodged this bullet.
I disagree that this was a bad idea because I know that we needed that foundational change, to be recognised and to have a guaranteed representative body. Not politicians that purport to speak for us, like the one that we've just heard, not having political parties choose Indigenous people for us, but having us choose our leaders ourselves. We got that right. Indigenous people, Indigenous leaders, one thing we do know is that we're never going to give up fighting for our rights, our rightful place in this country.
So, it seems, at least from my reading, that Thomas Mayo believes Indigenous people are a special class of people who should not be subject to the democratic process all other Australians are subject to when choosing our leaders. Instead, Mayo seems to think Indigenous people should be exempt from Australian democracy and elect their own leaders based on race, not political party. Now, call me crazy, but that sounds like racial privilege, doesn't it? Conferring special extra rights on one group of people because they are of a certain race? Perhaps that's what was meant in the extra 25 pages of the Uluru Statement from the Heart when it spoke of recognising the ancient jurisdictions of First Nations law. Certainly, Thomas Mayo didn't seem too concerned about Australian common law or democracy when he made this comment on referendum night before the no result came in.
And it doesn't matter what happens tonight. If it is a no answer, then we're not lying down, we're not taking no for an answer, and we will continue.
Make no mistake, this whole thing was a power grab, initiated by resentful race agitators with an axe to grind under the guise of seeking to help Indigenous people who face appalling disadvantage. And I am thanking my lucky stars that Australians by and large had the good sense to see through the emotional blackmail and vote no.